I don't know if anyone else has noticed, but the last few years have been absolutely wild for airline travel. It seems like you can't go a single week without seeing a new viral video circulating on the internet. These videos always show some angry passenger at an airport or on a plane, screaming their head off or starting fights with other travelers and airline staff, usually for the most ridiculous reasons. Sure, it might be entertaining when you're sitting comfortably at home, scrolling through Reddit or Twitter. You might laugh at these videos, shake your head at how stupid people can be, and then just keep scrolling without giving it another thought. Unfortunately, that's not an option when you're actually working at the airport and dealing with these situations firsthand. I've honestly lost count of how many times I've had to call security to handle an aggressive or flat-out violent customer over the past couple of years. The crazy thing is, most of the incidents that set people off are surprisingly minor and completely avoidable issues. Some passengers throw a fit because they want to board right now, even though it's not their turn yet, so they start harassing me and my coworkers. Others get into heated screaming matches because another passenger looked at them funny. I've even seen grown adults start whining louder than crying babies just to make a point. And would you believe it? I once had to break up a fight because someone got the last chocolate donut with sprinkles from the airport bakery. I swear, you wouldn't believe half the stuff I've witnessed. As you can imagine, I eventually got tired of it all. Getting up every morning for work, wondering what kind of unhinged person was going to cause problems for me that day, it really started to wear me down. So, I decided it was time to look for a new job. A few weeks into my job search, though, I started having doubts about finding something suitable. The main problem was that all my skills and experience were in the airline industry. I didn't have many options beyond other airline jobs within realistic reach. While I was open to relocating if it meant working at another major airport, I really wasn't excited about the prospect of dealing with the same issues somewhere else. Then one night, during a 1 a.m. job search after a particularly long shift at the airport, running on nothing but jittery movements from room temperature coffee, I stumbled across an interesting job listing. It was for a place called Pine Airport, a rural airport somewhere in the Midwest. I immediately sat up straighter in my chair and took another sip of my lukewarm coffee as I examined the posting more closely. The pictures of the place gave me a good idea of its size, and it looked absolutely perfect, tiny, with just a couple of runways, a single terminal, and this really charming interior design that reflected all the beautiful forestry surrounding it. I could already picture myself working there, dealing with far fewer people and much less drama than I was used to. Any lingering doubts or concerns were quickly pushed aside by my overwhelming excitement. James and I spent the next few minutes reviewing our schedules and settling on a start date. After ending the call, I slumped back in my uncomfortable break room chair, letting out a mix between a sigh of disbelief and a nervous chuckle. The whole thing felt surreal. I'm well aware that it's standard practice to give at least a 2-week notice to your employer, and that moving across states for a new job typically requires extensive planning and preparation. But I was so desperate to escape my current situation that, through a combination of eagerness and what was probably a healthy dose of recklessness, we settled on a start date just barely over a week away. At the end of my shift that day, I broke the news to my manager. Though she couldn't hide her displeasure at the short notice, she assured me it wouldn't be a problem. I suspect she had dealt with enough sudden departures to know the drill by now. My final day at the old airport was nothing short of horrendous. A fitting send-off, really. Just 2 hours into my shift, an entitled couple stormed up to my counter, screaming and demanding refunds for their tickets without any valid reason. When I explained that no, they would not be able to fly for free, both husband and wife erupted into a synchronized display of threats and obscenities that would have made a sailor blush. Security was called to the terminal immediately, and as soon as they arrived to handle the situation, I checked my watch. My shift was over. I let out the deepest sigh of relief in my life and practically skipped away from that chaos for the last time. Despite running on minimal sleep and facing a long, undoubtedly stressful drive ahead of me, I felt more energetic and hopeful than I had in years. The prospect of this new beginning had given me a second wind. To my pleasant surprise, the drive went remarkably smoothly, no traffic jams, no car troubles, not even a single wrong turn until I got close to my destination. I arrived earlier than expected and checked into the modest motel room I'd rented for the week while I sorted out more permanent living arrangements. After unceremoniously dumping a few boxes of personal items and a suitcase stuffed with clothes onto the worn carpet, I didn't even bother to properly unpack. I just turned off the lights and collapsed onto the bed. I was out cold before my head fully settled into the pillow. I woke up that evening feeling surprisingly refreshed and eager to start my first shift. I got dressed quickly, making sure my appearance was impeccable. First impressions matter, after all. I left early, hoping to arrive with plenty of time to spare. However, I had naively underestimated how my unfamiliarity with the local roads would slow me down. After what felt like an endless series of wrong turns down poorly lit country roads, I finally arrived at the little airport with mere minutes to spare. My heart was racing as I pulled into the nearly empty parking lot. The airport was even smaller in person than the pictures had suggested, which somehow made it even more charming. I hurried through the entrance, where I was greeted by a small team of security officers who seemed remarkably laid back compared to my previous workplace. After I explained that I was there for work and that James was expecting me, they waved me through without so much as a cursory bag check. Everything about this place, from the casual security to the rustic architecture and the beautiful forest scenery that surrounded it, felt worlds apart from my previous job. It was exactly what I had been hoping for. Walking through the quiet terminal, I found it completely devoid of passengers, with James sitting alone behind a counter at the far end. After a moment, he looked up, and upon making eye contact, his tired face broke into that same warm smile I remembered from our video call. I was about to apologize profusely for my near tardiness, but before I could get the words out, he enthusiastically led me to the employee locker room. There, I found my new uniform and badge already waiting in my very own locker. He told me to get changed and meet him outside right away, his voice carrying an odd urgency that I attributed to the late hour. Following his instructions, I quickly changed and walked back out to find him behind the console at the counter, gathering his belongings. He noticed me approaching and glanced up, thanking me again for showing up and starting on such short notice. As he handed me a fresh cup of coffee that smelled infinitely better than what I was used to, he apologized for not being able to stick around longer during my first shift. However, something in his tone suggested he wasn't particularly worried about leaving me alone. "I have to be going now, I've been on duty for 17 hours, he said, stifling a yawn. "I know you're plenty familiar with our systems and software. You know what you're doing." He gave me a reassuring pat on the back before stepping out from behind the desk. Then he turned and added, almost as an afterthought, "It'll be a quiet night for you anyway. No flights scheduled. Just sit back, relax, and, oh yeah, most importantly, I nearly forgot. The rules on the laminated sheet were typed in a clean, professional font, spaced neatly down the page. As I read through them, each one seemed more bizarre than the last. Rule 1 stood out immediately: all lights must stay on at all times. If one goes out, turn it back on immediately. If it can't be fixed, leave the area and report it later. Most unsettling was the final line: do not listen to the sounds. Do not listen to the voices. Rule 2 seemed straightforward enough. During rain or storms, I could disregard rules 3, 4, and 5. But I had to stay inside no matter what. Something about the simplicity of this rule made it feel more ominous than reassuring. Rule 3 detailed an encounter that would supposedly happen between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. A young woman named Elizabeth would emerge from the women's restroom and enter the terminal. She would sit, occasionally moving around or changing seats. The rule was explicit: while I could look at her, give nonverbal gestures, or even shake her hand, I absolutely could not speak to her. If I did break this rule, I'd have to go to the men's restroom and wait for her to leave, though this contradicted Rule 2 about avoiding the men's restroom entirely. Rule 4 described a janitor in blue coveralls who would arrive between 1 o'clock and 2 a.m. I was to crack open the door and ask his name. Only if he identified himself as Simon was I to let him in. Any other name meant immediately shutting and locking the door before walking away. The rule noted that Simon, if it was indeed him, would attend to his duties and wouldn't interfere with mine. Unlike Elizabeth, I was permitted to talk with Simon. Rule 5 was perhaps the most unsettling. Around 3 a.m., a black and red Cessna Skyhawk would somehow appear on one of the airstrips. The rule emphasized that I would never see it land or take off. It would simply be there when I wasn't looking. Once spotted, I was to avoid looking at it again. There was apparently a reference photo of this exact plane somewhere behind the counter. Rule 6 warned of a possible visit from a group of men claiming to be TSA agents, arriving sometime before dawn. They would have their own key and could search the airport freely, except for one crucial restriction: under no circumstances were they allowed to enter the skybridge without verbal approval. The rule assured me they couldn't harm me, but something about needing that assurance was deeply unsettling. After reading through the list several times, I set down the laminated sheet and leaned back in my chair, taking a long contemplative sip of my coffee. What in the world had I just read? James hadn't struck me as someone with such an active imagination, let alone someone who would be unprofessional. Though now that I thought about it, everything about this job had been unusual: the rushed hiring process, the hurried handoff, the minimal details provided. I briefly considered whether this was all an elaborate prank. Maybe it was some sort of initiation ritual for new employees? But I quickly dismissed that idea. This was definitely a real airport. I'd done my research thoroughly before accepting the position. There were regular flights during the day, and James had been working here for years according to my background check. It seemed unlikely he'd risk his career just to scare a new hire. After chuckling at the absurdity of my situation, I decided to play along. Perhaps this was some kind of test to see if I could follow instructions precisely. I checked my phone's weather forecast: clear skies all night, not a cloud in sight. Great, I muttered to myself. That meant all the rules would be in effect. I'd have to watch out for both Elizabeth and Simon, while somehow avoiding looking at a plane that would materialize out of nowhere. Standing up with my coffee in hand, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lit runways stretched out before me like ribbons of light against the darkness, creating a surprisingly beautiful scene. As I raised my cup to finish the last of my coffee, the sharp sound of clicking heels against the floor somewhere behind me made me jump. I spun around abruptly, dropping my cup and sending what remained of my coffee splashing across the floor. At the far end of the terminal stood a young woman who appeared to be in her mid-20s. She carried 2 large leather suitcases, one in each hand, and was dressed in what I could only describe as vintage fashion, an elegant skirt and heels that seemed more appropriate for the 1950s than the present day. What struck me most was her remarkable beauty and the warmth of her smile. "Oh, I'm sorry, dear. Didn't mean to startle you," she said, her voice carrying a genuinely apologetic tone. I opened my mouth to assure her it was fine, but caught myself just in time. The rules, I remembered them now. At this point, I was convinced she must be an actor James had hired to test me, to see if I would break the rules. Well, I wasn't about to fail this test. Instead of speaking, I straightened my uniform, fixed my posture, and returned her smile. She approached the counter, setting her leather suitcases down before walking closer to me. "Looks like we've got this fabulous airport all to ourselves. I'm Elizabeth," she said, extending her hand. I shook it politely, maintaining my silence. "And your name is?" she prompted, letting the question hang in the air. I kept smiling and maintained eye contact, which seemed to amuse her. "You don't seem to be much of a talkative one," she remarked, her grin widening slightly before she turned away. I was sorely tempted to break the rule and thank Elizabeth for her thoughtful gesture with the magazine, but I held firm. The next couple of hours passed in an almost peaceful rhythm, Elizabeth and I reading through our magazines, occasionally exchanging glances and polite smiles across the empty terminal. During this time, she made at least half a dozen more attempts to get me to speak. The hardest to resist was when she sweetly asked if I wanted another magazine, her voice carrying a warmth that made my enforced silence feel almost cruel. At a little past 1:30 a.m., a knock echoed through the quiet terminal. Both Elizabeth and I looked toward the entrance. "Oh, that must be the nice cleaner man," she remarked with a light giggle before returning to her magazine, seeming completely unfazed by a janitor arriving at this unusual hour. I walked over to the front doors where a man in his mid-30s stood waiting patiently, dressed in blue coveralls that matched the description from the rules perfectly. As I unlocked the door and he took a step to enter, I suddenly remembered the crucial detail from Rule 4. I quickly closed the door halfway, probably more forcefully than necessary, and commanded, "Wait." The man looked up at me, startled by my abruptness. "What is your name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady despite my nerves. An innocent smile spread across his face. "I'm Simon," he announced with unexpected enthusiasm. "The janitor here. Did James let you know I was coming tonight?" I stood there for a moment, mentally reviewing Rule 4 before nodding and reopening the door to let him in. Once inside, Simon walked purposefully toward the janitor's closet near the men's restroom. I followed him somewhat suspiciously for the next few minutes as he began his cleaning routine, but gradually relaxed as I convinced myself that he was just a regular janitor and that James had probably invented the name-checking rule as some sort of security theater. Returning to my counter in the terminal, I tried to focus on my magazine again. Simon would occasionally pass by, attending to his duties in different parts of the airport, while Elizabeth would sometimes stand to examine the various artwork displayed throughout the terminal. This peaceful routine continued for about 30 minutes before Simon approached the terminal counter with his mop in hand. He seemed to be eyeing the 2 leather suitcases Elizabeth had left there. Assuming he wanted to clean that area, I got up to move them. I grabbed each handle, but to my shock, couldn't lift them even an inch off the ground. Confused, I stepped back to check if they were somehow caught on something, but they weren't. They were just 2 ordinary-looking suitcases sitting exactly where Elizabeth had placed them. I tried lifting just one again, this time with both hands, putting my back and legs into it with all my strength. It wouldn't budge even slightly. Looking up at Simon in confusion, I noticed him nodding his head in Elizabeth's direction. When I turned to look at her, she had already noticed my disheveled appearance and obvious struggle with her luggage. She smiled that unnervingly sweet smile of hers and stood up. "Let me get that for you," she insisted. With disturbing ease, she lifted both impossibly heavy leather suitcases and moved them closer to her seat. When she lowered them this time, she let them drop the last few inches. The sound they made when hitting the ground was like a thunderclap, a boom that echoed through the empty airport, making me flinch violently. I glanced at Simon, who hadn't reacted at all to the supernatural display. He just continued mopping as if nothing unusual had happened. I slowly made my way back to my seat, keeping my eyes fixed on Elizabeth the entire time. When she noticed my stare, she just grinned and returned to her magazine, seeming amused by my obvious shock. Simon eventually noticed my distress as well. He paused his mopping and approached me, speaking in a hushed tone, I know. Stick to the rules and everything will be just fine. Trust me." I could only nod in response as he returned to his cleaning. A few minutes of tense silence passed before Elizabeth's voice cut through the quiet. "What a remarkable aircraft," she exclaimed, looking out through the glass panes facing the runways. Almost automatically, I followed her gaze to where a lone black and red airplane now sat on the runway, an airplane I was certain hadn't been there moments ago. I spun around to look at the reference picture displayed behind the counter, and my blood ran cold. It was an exact match. When I turned back to the window, my heart nearly stopped. A dark silhouette of a person now stood next to the plane, facing directly toward the terminal windows, toward us. "Stop looking at it," Simon muttered urgently from behind me. When I turned to face him, he quickly cowered, seemingly embarrassed by his forceful tone, but I was immensely grateful for his warning. I quickly reviewed Rule 5 again, focusing on the part that explicitly stated not to look at the plane twice. I muttered harsh self-criticisms under my breath, but they were barely audible over my now heavy, frantic breathing. My eyes darted frantically across the other rules on the paper, anything to keep from looking outside again. This continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 10 minutes before my breathing finally started to steady. I found myself silently praying that whatever, or whoever, was out there would just disappear. Elizabeth suddenly approached my counter, making me snap my head up with a nervous jerk to meet her gaze. "I'm going to get some more reading material." "Want another one of those?" she asked, reaching toward my National Geographic magazine. I looked up and managed to force a smile while nodding, but as she walked away, my concentration slipped. Almost unconsciously, my eyes drifted back to the plane on the runway. The silhouette had moved. It was now hundreds of feet closer to the building, still facing directly toward me. Ice-cold chills ran up my spine as I wrenched my gaze back to my desk, my whole body beginning to shake as the panicked breathing returned. Moments later, Elizabeth returned and placed a fresh magazine on the counter, running a comforting hand over my shoulder. Simon appeared behind me, placing his hand on my back. "He'll be gone soon, and so will the plane. Just don't look at it again," he assured me quietly. "Mind if I clean here?" he then asked. I got up and moved to the end of the counter, watching him methodically clean the floor before looking up and whispering a soft "thank you." He nodded and smiled back warmly. "What was that?" Elizabeth asked sharply. I turned towards her. "Oh, I was just thanking Simon for dash." The horrifying realization of my mistake hit me mid-sentence. My eyes locked with Elizabeth's as she slowly rose from her seat, her pleasant smile melting away into something terrible. Blood began pouring from her eyes and nose, first in thin streams, then in alarming quantities. Her quiet sobbing quickly transformed into hysterical wails before culminating in a blood-curdling screech, a sound that seemed to contain both infinite pain and murderous rage. In one fluid motion, she grabbed one of her impossibly heavy suitcases and hurled it at me with supernatural force. I barely managed to dodge as it crashed into the wall behind me with enough force to crack the plaster. This time, my survival instincts kicked in quickly. I remembered Rule 3 and made a desperate sprint for the men's restroom. Elizabeth was right behind me, but I managed to slam the door shut and lock it just in time. She pounded on the door with inhuman strength several times before suddenly stopping. "So that's how you dance, is it, love? I can play that game," she snickered, her voice dripping with malice. I heard her flip a light switch outside the bathroom, and the clicking of her heels began to fade away. A few minutes of tense silence passed before I started to hear laughter from the other side of the door. One voice grew to 2, then 3, then multiplied into what sounded like 10 distinct voices. While some continued their now hysterical laughter, others began to scream horrible, inhuman sounds that made my blood run cold. I crumpled to the floor, covering my ears as the cacophony of voices grew increasingly manic, only to be suddenly silenced by another flip of the light switch. "It's over now. She's gone, and so is the plane. I've got to be getting out of here soon," Simon's calm and friendly voice called out. I reluctantly exited the bathroom and followed him back to the counter, where he had thoughtfully prepared another coffee for me. "Wish I could have done more there, but you'll come to find out that when Elizabeth gets angry, you just got to let her do her thing," he said quietly. I looked up at him, still too shaken to form words. Over the next few minutes, Simon methodically cleaned Elizabeth's blood from the floor before returning his supplies to the janitor's closet. He checked his watch and sighed. "I better get out of here. Good luck with the rest of your night. I hope I'll be seeing you soon," he said, giving me a pitying look. Something in his expression told me he'd seen many others in my position before, and that he didn't have any choice about when he had to leave. After watching him exit, I returned to my seat behind the counter, feeling more alone and terrified than ever. But the solitude didn't last long. Mere minutes after Simon's departure, the doors burst open as men in tactical gear, most with faces concealed behind masks and goggles, rushed into the airport. I jumped up from my seat, watching helplessly as they swept through the building, checking every room at gunpoint, initially acting as if I didn't exist. After clearing the entire building, the team of about 20 armed men gathered in the terminal seating area. A man in a suit, whom I hadn't noticed enter, stepped to the front of the group. "I'm with TSA. I'm going to need you to answer some questions," he demanded. I nodded numbly. "How many individuals have you seen in this airport since the security team left the building, besides myself?" "2 inside, 1 outside," I answered, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Was the individual outside next to a black and red Cessna Skyhawk?" "Yes," I replied, maintaining my composure. The man in the suit nodded and paused before making his final demand. "We're going to need to search the skybridge." I glanced back at the rules sheet on the counter, double-checking before straightening my uniform and taking a defiant step forward. "No," I stated firmly. The man's face darkened with irritation. "If you do not step aside and give us permission to search, I'm afraid I'll have to detain you." Already exhausted and worn down by the night's events, I wasn't about to break the last rule. I decided to be bold, looking a little well-armed for TSA, "Wouldn't you agree?" He ignored my remark. "Last chance. Step aside." "No," I repeated, my voice unwavering. Visibly angered by my defiance, the man in the suit turned to his right and raised his chin in a silent signal. The last thing I heard was the deafening sound of gunfire before collapsing to the floor. I felt life leaving my body as everything faded to black. The next thing I was aware of was the sensation of my hand gripping a water bottle and James's familiar voice. "I see you made it through the first night intact. Looks like you got to meet Simon. He's a nice guy. You'll get to like him. And Elizabeth, well, she's something else, isn't she?" I opened my eyes and looked up at James. "Am I dead?" I asked, my voice coming out hoarse. James chuckled. No, you did great. You're just fine. Although, it seems you might have been a bit assertive with our undead TSA Special Forces wannabes. I'd suggest a gentler tone and choice of words. Maybe I should add that to the rules sheet." He smiled. "They can't harm you, but as you saw, they can give you quite a scare." I was speechless. Slowly, I pulled myself up from the ground and looked out at the sunrise over the airfield. James held out an envelope, and inside, I found a neat stack of crisp $100 bills. "A little bonus for your first night. It's a lot to take in at first, but I promise you get used to it." I turned to James, anger burning in my eyes, and finally spoke. "What the hell is wrong with you? How is it okay to put someone through this without a single warning? Keep your money. I'm done. I'm going to call the cops." I started walking toward the exit, but James stepped in front of me. "Look, I get it, it's not fair to you. But it wasn't fair for me either. It's not fair to any of us. And what would you expect me to do? Someone has to cover the night shift. You wouldn't have believed a word of this if I told you up front. You'd think I was nuts. And if you tell the police, they'll think the same about you. I needed you to see it yourself." He took a deep breath to calm down before continuing. "This money is yours with no strings attached. You're free to leave and never come back. There's no shame in it." I felt myself calm down, though I still couldn't bring myself to meet his eyes. James went on, "If you decide to stay, meet me in my office to finish up your paperwork." Then he turned and walked back toward the front of the airport. I stood there for a moment, watching as the first passengers of the day walked through the entrance. Whether I was ready for this job or not, I knew one thing. I wasn't about to go back to another overcrowded city airport. With a steady breath, I turned and headed to James's office.